Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live episode of Inlay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari. We have in-house with us Mr. Dale Richardson, back with us. How are you doing, Dale?
I'm doing all right. Thursday, getting to the holiday season. Was hoping it would slow down, but criminals still want to hide their crimes, right?
Yeah, there's no Christmas break for them, I guess.
No. Especially when they're afraid of what's happening coming south of the border.
Yeah, I see them. They're in full panic mode. Like the Trudeau administration is imploding, and I always tell people, to me, it's like a pressure cooker where they're putting the people under so much pressure, and pressure cookers always have that release valve, but there's no release valve, and they keep increasing the pressure with all these bills.
Yes, they are. And a lot of the bills that they're putting down there are to protect themselves. Like our system, if anybody really examines the way our system works, it was never designed to work. It was designed to look like it worked until it didn't. Because a lot of the controls lead right back up to Parliament and Cabinet and the Privy Council and so forth, and to Trudeau himself. And so if you have those positions compromised, you're never going to get justice. Never.
You're saying they're compromised. I'm starting to see 2015 as a coup d'etat. Like they just brought this drama teacher in, propped them up, and now they're just pushing through all of these bad policies.
Yes, when you look at what's going on and you look at the way that Trudeau came in, and when I was looking at one of the, let me pull up the name here so that I can get it right. I was looking at one of the election integrity, um, t- um, one of the election integrity documents that was put out in Parliament. Let me just pull this up and then I'll get it correctly because I'm going through this, and what I'm looking at, this is absolutely absurd. It's the special report on foreign interference for the National Security and Intelligence Committee of parliamentarians. Now, this document, when it comes down there, they tell you that they don't really have the power to do that, and they have to have the parliament the ones to investigate. And this is why, when you look constitutionally speaking in the United States, they have certain things that aren't designated to certain branches of the government because you can't. Because in Canada, in order to get these things, you have to assume that your cabinet and your government is going to be free from corruption. But that's not the case, because we know that there's foreign interference coming from China, and then it's also in this report, it outlines that India is also one of the places where you're getting a lot of foreign interference. So if you have foreign interference in your cabinet and your privy council and your prime minister, potentially, which all intents and purposes is very indicative that it is corruption, then the agencies that report to them and that are under their control, how can they investigate when the ones that are controlling them and making sure that there's laws there to be prosecuted? How do you actually prosecute them? You can't. They have the control. And so this is one of the things that they outlined in this documentation, that they need to get the laws in place and they need to have expanded powers. And even the way that they try to define foreign interference, they use it in a very limited scope. They don't include in the definition of foreign interference foreign actors helping to commit treason in Canada. That's not in the definition, and that is absolutely absurd. So the guys that were, example, escorted out of the Winnipeg Biolab in 2018 by the RCMP, that then they ended up having the transferring the biological weapons to the Chinese nationals, and that sequencing out of the Winnipeg Biolab was then put into the sequencing that was released out of Wuhan, knowing that they were integral into doing that.
Let's put a pin in the Winnipeg thing. We'll get to that, but that one, like, you really have to hold the audience's hand.
Okay.
So, foreign interference, corruption, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about like one of the MPs went to buy some drugs and the Indian security service got him on video and they're blackmailing him, or is he just taking money from Indians?
There's a lot of taking of money. They're supporting candidates. They're getting into their communities, and they are pressuring them to vote a certain way. And you're getting a lot of working through corporations and other proxies and agents to fund them. So, right, you'll have, for example, in Canada, the way that the corporations in Canada, if you look at the federal corporations, you can open and close numbered corporations very easily. And in, for example, a province like Saskatchewan, if you register a corporation in Saskatchewan, you don't have to disclose the ownership. Like in Alberta, you have to put it on the public record who has ownership of the corporation. In Saskatchewan, you do not. So you can open and close corporations, fund money, close them down very quickly to make it harder to track. So they're getting money in and control and pressuring people at different levels, and every level of government is susceptible to this foreign interference.
I'm trying to hold the audience's hand. So let's take me, for example. I'm Iranian. I'm running for office.
Okay.
Is it that the IRGC, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is opening up a numbered company in Saskatchewan and then paying assassins to go and threaten the families that don't vote for me?
Well, they would probably have people that are connected to there, right? Because they don't want to have direct connections, but you can trace the connections. They work through a number of proxies, and then they would get somebody indirectly that is connected that you can trace right back to them. That they would then open a corporation. They would funnel money through that. They would then come over here in Canada, and then they would funnel money to other agencies, NGOs, whoever, to go and to start donating to funds to different campaigns to sway people to get them in office. Then they would have in their thugs and whoever else like that to start putting the squeeze down. If they have families back at home, then they would put the squeeze down on their families and be like, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. These are the type of tactics that they do. And then when the people, for example, like the immigrants who just newly come over, they have family with elderly people that don't speak English. They're very easy to target because they're very much isolated, because they're really not assimilated into the culture, right? So these are the kind of tactics they use.
So, how do you deal with that? If you have new immigrants here and their families are being threatened back home, what do you what was a CSIS going to have to do the same thing in India, like the retribution?
Well, they need to, like, first of all, they should be able to go and start arresting them. And when people are working in conjunction to do things against Canada in the criminal code, they can start going and extraditing people that were helping to do things like this in Canada. And and India being a Commonwealth country, it's not that hard to go ahead and get extradition across the Commonwealth, as opposed to other countries that are not there, because we have fairly similar laws. And because Canada doesn't have the death penalty, people will be like, if you commit a crime there, well, you can serve it out there. You're not going to get killed. But I mean, there's a number of things they can do. And obviously the public exposure is one of them, right?
So I'm going to read two comments from the remanded. He's a patriot over here in BC. He's investigating the election fraud. Some of the ways which foreign influence was opened was third-party advertising. Limited funds were available to candidates as long as it was submitted 6 months plus a day prior to the call of an election. You didn't have to report these funds, which shocked Senator Linda at the time, stating unlimited funds could be available to candidates. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, they did. That was something they actually did identify as the third party, and then the funds. Not only that, but the payments to media, the disinformation, the suppression of information, and of note, they actually were using the intelligence agencies in Canada to support the whole Clinton Russiagate thing that was going on in the States. So when you're looking at they reported this, and when I read this, I was like, what? I mean, that's not objectivity, right? If you're going to be looking at that, you have to look at all angles. And it wasn't difficult to find out what was going on in many of the cases. And this is not a good, they're not directing things in the right way. It seems like they're getting a lot of direction on where to look rather than being objective. Because if you're getting your orders from the top and they're the ones who are justifying your budgets and everything else like that, you bring back bad reports about what they're doing, what ends up happening, right?
So I was listening to the National Citizens Inquiry. They had a news series of testimonies, witness testimonies, and
Yes.
one was an RCMP officer, and he said he used the phrase membrane. Like he said, there used to be a membrane between law enforcement and the elected officials, and that membrane's been perforated. Now the upper class of law enforcement is sort of interconnected, and it's almost difficult to investigate these guys. What do you think about that?
It is. We watched this happening, like when you're looking at what they were having issues with the commissions and so forth, what happened with Brenda Lucky, and they brought in there where they were directing her to do certain things, and that should never happen. Like the RCMP are pretty much basically Trudeau's personal goon squad, and they're being treated as such. And the guys that are on the ground are not getting to do the jobs that they want to, because not every RCMP is corrupt. That's nonsense. A lot of guys come in there because they want to do what's right, but they promote certain people because they put other people in place. And they did mention that there is infiltration and foreign interference even in the law enforcement. So some of the people that we're looking at in law enforcement are under the control of foreign entities, which is, again, not something that should be done, whether it be bribes, whether it be pressure, whatever the case may be. They outlined a number of things in these reports, and there's others that they have there. And of course, these things are not given the necessary tools to do a full report. And in many cases, they're whitewashed because, again, you're going to the people that you're investigating to come in and get the tools to do your investigation. Right? So
Before we get to like the solution, how do we fix this problem? How did this report get out? Like, was it just one case where cabinet couldn't prevent this from coming out?
no, they were asked. This was actually asked for. This was part of all of this, the foreign interference that they were talking about. This was part of that. This was part of all of that, but all of this didn't come out. Like a lot of people didn't read what was going on. They listened to what was happening, and I would suggest that people go back and read the reports, because there were 3 of them over since I believe 2019, right? And this one was the most recent one. And so what we're seeing is that we're not getting they're not getting the proper tools. Like they're getting done, but it's like the Cullen Commission that they had in BC. They had to do something, but it was very much watered down, and a lot of things didn't get into it. It's just a
Yeah,
lot of public
I guess
posture.
watered down is a phrase here. We're having some technical issues on X, so I don't know. Maybe it was something you said, Dale. Musk didn't like.
I'm pretty sure it might have been something I said.
Yeah, I guess so let me clarify my question. This gentleman, is it Michel, his name, the former CSIS agent? That's
I think that's his name.
yeah. Like I feel like um, all we have are bad actors. All we have is antagonists in this theater that is politics. And then you get this one good group coming out of CSIS. To me it feels like CSIS is the only white knight in this story.
Well, yes and no, because within every agency, what you're going to get is you're going to have people that are going to do right, and you're going to have people that are going to do wrong, right? And so they're not all good actors in CSIS. Like there's infiltration in every agency. Like not everybody in the RCMP is bad. I've actually encountered some people there that were good and they did their jobs, wanted to do their jobs, but then they have people that are working against them. And you're seeing this across the board. And so, I mean, CSIS, they did the report as best they could. Some guys wanted to contribute and put information forward, but they still didn't get to put all the information forward. None of them are getting the tools that they need. And this was indicated in the report, right? I'm sure there's other things that they couldn't put in there, but they know that they don't have enough tools to actually do this properly. And that's a fault on this is a fault on Parliament because they're not giving them what they need to do their jobs.
So I'm not trying to be confrontational, but like CSIS is doing something. The RCMP has pretty much done nothing. Well, my question is, what is the constitutional check and balance that has allowed CSIS to at least do that something, but something is preventing the RCMP from doing anything?
The reason why CSIS has got more latitude to do things is that CSIS doesn't really have the power to administer justice. And the RCMP, technically, they don't. They circumvent a lot of constitutional authority to do so. This is why you see so much suppression in the RCMP as opposed to CSIS. CSIS can advise and do things, but they can't go out and just arrest very easily because in the separation of powers, the administration of justice lies exclusively within the provinces, and they try to circumvent that using the RCMP by contracting them to the provinces. But because they don't have exclusive control over the RCMP within the provinces, that makes them unconstitutional. Now, can they have a national police force to protect federal buildings and stuff? Sure, they can. But can they have them operating within the provinces under the way that they're doing now? Absolutely not. Can they coordinate things at a federal level? Sure, they can help coordinate. But the way that they're operating now, completely unconstitutional. But because they're given the power to arrest and do those types of investigations, that's why you see more suppression within the RCMP.
Okay. One final question before we leave this election interference thing behind. The RCMP has always been a federal police force that's operated provincially. What's changed in the last few decades that now all of a sudden they've gone rogue?
Well, they were designed. My sister used to work for the RCMP, and they have systems inside of there that some people will never see because based on security clearances and so forth. So if you have certain people, you can construct certain channels that no one else except specific people will see. So now you can operate certain types of people in there. And it was a slow process to go and get the right people to commit crimes inside of your federal police force. But the problem that we ended up happening was we allowed the contracting of RCMP into the provinces. That should have never happened. I don't know why people did this at this point in time, because the only provision that they have federally for under the Constitution Act 1867 in Article 6, Section 92, subsection 14, in the administration of justice, in the provision and in the separation of powers, is the appointment of judges and creation of the laws and so forth. But the actual administration is the control of the provinces, and it says that they are to have exclusive control of the administration of justice. Law enforcement is part of that. So they, at some point, somebody knew that they were operating with an unconstitutional police force. And in doing so, then this allowed the progression of this to take place over time. And now you've got basically the brown shirts. But it was a steady period of time to allow this to happen. Because the RCMP, they weren't always like this, but there was always corruption. If you look into the history, you'll see it.
Right, but the RCMP, right from 1867, they were operating as a police force for communities that couldn't. That they always operated nationally, right?
Well, they were using them as the Northwest Mounted Police. That's where they came in to come into the territories, right? And they were there to help put down the rebellion out there. That's one of the primary things, and to suppress the Indians out in this area in Western Canada, primarily Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and so forth, with the Louis Riel and all that sort of stuff. But when they began to start bringing them into the provinces, and the territories are kind of a gray area, and they're not really addressed. But since now, with the formation of the provinces, they then started to contract them in, and contracting them in and leaving the control with Ottawa over the police forces rather than the provinces. That's where the inconstitutionality comes in. But it was left alone because people were so used to dealing with it. I don't know whether it was oversight, deliberate, whatever. Those people who did that, they're all dead, right? We don't know, right? So long ago. But now we have to deal with the results of that and fix it.
Um, what I'm driving at is, was there an inflection point? Like, was it after 9/11 when the RCMP started really getting involved in people's day-to-day lives? Or did, like, what changed?
I think overtly we started to see it more after 9/11, where that was where things started to ramp up, and then it became very, very visible to people during COVID, right? How much surveillance was being done and so forth, and the unlawful surveillance that they were doing, right?
And final question, like the solution to this, if let's say tomorrow we got rid of the RCMP or every province had their own national police force, would that really address the issue? Because I see the same corruption at the provincial level too.
What has to be done is that they have to not only just like change the structure of the policing to make it in line with the Constitution, but they need to have more checks and balances, and the people that are in the provincial governments that didn't do their job, they need to be replaced. Like, end of story. And they need to make sure that they're going to need to be some reforms, potentially constitutional reforms in Canada, so that there is written into our legislation and our constitution protections, clear protections for restraint of the government. For example, the judges. Look at the justice system, right? What people don't realize is that when the justice system is corrupt as it is, there's only one place that can fix it, and that is listed in the Constitution, because the administration of justice is the exclusive control of the legislative assemblies of each province. And so when that breaks down, the elected officials definitely have the ability to fix it. For example, Danielle Smith, she talked about Alberta contracting the RCMP and directing them to clean up the situation at Coots. That demonstrates that they have control over the administration of justice. But when the judges then retaliated against Dr. Makis after his wife made criminal complaints, which is her right to do, that's criminal intimidation, right? Under the criminal code. Can't do that. But rather than doing anything, she says, well, we don't have control over the administration of justice, and we can't interfere into the legal process. And normally, if it's just following due process, that's fine. But when under the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights, like, any family member can make a complaint, and because Dr. Makis and his wife are married, and the judges that were going after them and using lawfare, which is a form of financial exploitation, and using a political motive to do that, that's a crime, right? So now his wife reports this because of the malicious intent and so forth. They then go ahead and retaliate against him using the courts to come after him and now want to imprison him. That is criminal intimidation. Danielle Smith and the Alberta government have an obligation to stop it, but she's saying that she can't interfere when judges are engaged in criminal activity using the court system. That is way off base. And that's why they need to be replaced, because if they refuse to do what is in their power to do, then they need to be replaced by people who will, and to structure it in a manner that there are clear separation and ensure that there are no more incidents like this ever happening again.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the system isn't broken. It's just the tools are there. They're just not using those tools. They're using them when it's politically expedient, but not when it's not.
Yes, they have tools that are there. They need more tools, but the tools that they already have, they're not using them at all whatsoever. None. Not a single one.
Um, we got another comment. I want you to break this down for me. From Schmeichel. 2019 committee chief electoral official Stephen Perot stated he didn't have the powers to intervene when he received the CSIS report. He appoints commissioner and the two work in tandem. It's BS.
What they're supposed to do is to go to places to get criminal investigations. Now, a lot of these electoral officials, they don't have powers under the criminal code, and most federal agencies, they don't. They have to start referring them to places, and the provinces are really the ones that start the ball rolling, right? Because we have no federal criminal court system. We don't. All federal crimes are prosecuted within the provinces. Even the federal crowns that they have, they call it the public prosecutors. They are not even constitutional. They're not. This is why they don't call it the crowns office. They call it the public prosecutor, because federal crowns, there's no. It's done in the provinces. Only provision they have is the appointment of federal judges in the superior courts in the provinces. So there's this jurisdictional quagmire that is being created so that no one can do their jobs. And this is where they're sitting down. This is why the provinces, the onus is on them to start initiating these type of things. And they should be working with the provinces to deal with it, because that's how it's done. Because when you have federal crimes, they go into the superior courts like the King's Bench, or that would be the Supreme Court of British Columbia is where they would go.
So, time for a little ego boost. Peter Biker, thanks for the shout out. He says Dale Richardson always impresses me with his thorough analysis. I concur. You're like the best teacher for most of us. There was something else. The next thing I wanted to talk about was this concept of vexatious litigants. You used this phrase a couple in one of your interviews, and another lady, Shelley, I talked to, she mentioned that a vexatious litigant, is that like a judge's way of saying like I don't have to listen to you?
What vexatious litigants is designed for this, for somebody who comes in and abuses the court system just to attack people to create problems. It's supposed to stop people from engaging in lawfare by just going ahead and burdening people down because they're trying to start problems without actually any grounds to do something. So you don't want people abusing the system, but it should be done in very difficult cases. But what the courts have been doing now is that when people have reasonable grounds, or the state is engaging against lawfare against them, they will then deem them vexatious litigants. And if you examine, people treat judges like they're God, and they listen to the words of the judges without examining what the judges were doing. Because if you examine a lot of these vexatious litigants that are brought on by the state or people working as agents of the state, they're actually doing it to silence people, and they're doing it to take away their defense. Because then if they come in and attack you further, you can't defend yourself, because then when you go and you take and bring something in to say, well, this is my evidence for the defense, they're just like, well, no, sorry, we're not going to let you do it because you were a vexatious litigant, and they throw it out, right? I'll give you a personal example. When I went to the federal court, I got dragged into court first, and then they were as a defendant, and I was declared a vexatious litigant as a defendant, and I started to go and sue into the federal court because the province was violating the Constitution. They needed to be restrained, and they had federal agents, which were the RCMP, involved in that. Federal court is the place to go out and sue. Then they ended up getting the Saskatchewan Health Authority who was involved, and the Attorney General of Canada came in and they went ahead and filed papers for me to be a vexatious litigant and named anybody they called a proxy, like federal corporations and other people connected to me. Anybody, basically, they could say anybody associated with me could be deemed a vexatious litigant. They left it very ambiguous, and this is not the way this is done. But then they also used fraudulent shareholder information. The Attorney General of Canada did this because, like I said, Alberta has the shareholder information publicly. Anybody can go and pull this. The Attorney General of Canada would know this, but they didn't do that. They said that I had exclusive control over a corporation, which I didn't, which was a lie. There was a corporation that owned this, and this is on the public record. So they went in and they committed fraud to get a judgment against something they normally wouldn't have done, so that they could go ahead and suppress me. So then, after this, Engineer Canada comes in and they use every single engineering body, including the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists, to come after me in the Intellectual Property Office for something that was under the jurisdiction of the Canada Business Corporations Act. So they're intentionally doing something that's wrong. And they would have never been able to deal with this, right, if they didn't make me a vexatious litigant first. And the timing that they came out with was after they did this. And so they did this because knowing the only place that I could appeal it would be the federal court. And because the federal court has deemed me a vexatious litigant, they won't hear anything I have to say, because I put inside the federal court this stuff that was connected to the Winnipeg Biolabs, and they shut it all down. And they didn't want to hear it. So they were concealing treason. I got punished by the engineering bodies for outing something that they were also concealing and that had knowledge of since 2020, that they were notified by me, and they didn't take the public interest in there. So you can sit down and see how the vexatious litigation is being done. And you look at the same thing with Dr. Makis when he was exposing that they were pedophiles being protected by the College of Physicians of Alberta, and this was in the mainstream media, and all the different things that the Alberta Health Services were doing. Well, what did they do? They declared him a vexatious litigant. He had evidence, and they shut him down, right? This is their playbook.
Is this kind of, to me, it's like when you call somebody an anti-vaxxer or a climate denier, you're basically trying to shut them down without take away their ability to make their argument.
Yes, yes, that's exactly what it is. This is 100% political. And the funny thing is Lynn Lovitz, she was the one of the assistant deputy attorney general that reported directly to David Lametti. Her background was taxation, and she was also national security. National security. This is what she's doing. Why would you get somebody with that kind of background to come after someone like me? Because the evidence that I provided was a national security concern. When you create a method of effectively spreading the biological weapons that you hand over to a hostile nation, that's a national security risk. That's a grave one, especially when the method of spreading that comes from the CDC, your closest ally. So United States were helping guys in Canada commit treason so that they could then in turn commit treason against the United States as well. So you're looking at high treason, acts of war, and all of these things that they're doing. And this is what the evidence says, because with engineering, it's not like other sciences. And so they knew what they were doing. They had to break something to make something spread, to take away our freedom.
So we're coming to your Winnipeg story. Wolf is basically talking about lawfare here.
Yes.
I had Sean Buckley on a while back, and he said, 100% or maybe 99% of the time the Crown is in court, that Crown prosecutor's job is to justify taking away your rights. He was talking about that reasonable limits clause.
Yes.
So that's basically the Crown's job. I look at the judge, and the judge basically sees himself as the protector of the state. I look at the Crown works in the interest of the state. I look at the law enforcement. Law enforcement is there to protect the state. Everything that we set up to take care of us, which we used to call rule of law, it's just supposed to protect us. It's only us. It's changed now. It's been used against us now.
You're 100% correct on this, and this reasonable. This is one of the reasons why we also need a constitutional amendment. We need to bring the provinces together, because Section 1 needs to be stricken from the charter. You cannot have reasonable limits on Section 12 and Section 7. Absolutely not. You can't have reasonable limits on Section 2 either, because when you start muzzling free speech, freedom of religion, and so forth, then you lose all of the others. And you can't have reasonable limits on the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Like what? At some point, the state has a right to just execute you? Or Section 12. Does the state have reasonable limits to start torturing their own Canadians? No, they don't. So when you sit down and think about how the charter is subject to Section 1, that's absolutely insane. You cannot have any type of you cannot have a free and democratic society when you have reasonable limits to torture people and to murder people and to deprive them of their right to life, liberty, security, person. You just can't, right? And unjust detention. But the judges are using this Section 1 to justify all of these things. But when we're looking back, and this is why for example, I'll bring you over to like the petitions that I brought there forward. Now, the Constitution's in its two parts in Canada. You have the 1867, which came from the British North America Act, and then we have the 1982, right? The Charter. Under the 1867 Constitution, there are no reasonable limits on there. They're inalienable. Everything that is there's no restriction, because 1982 came after, and it can't apply to something that came before. So those provincial divisions of powers and all of that stuff that's laid out into the British North America Act, there's no limits to that, no reasonable limits. So when you come back and look at the division of powers, a judge cannot even deal with that, because the administration of justice is under the exclusive control of the legislative assemblies of each province. It's impossible for a judge to make a determination under something that is under the exclusive control of the province, because he's stepping out of line. He doesn't have the authority. Constitution says that, right? So when you bring that forward, this is why that I told people, I said, you need to bring this forward, because you have a right to do this, and they don't have any reasonable limits, no Section 1 justification for violating the division of powers, and they have to deal with it. You can't take no for an answer, but they're allowing that to happen. But back to the judges, they are definitely violating this to turn us into totalitarianism, and the charter does guarantee us a democratic society, a free society.
I'm going to go back to Sean Buckley. He's a really smart guy when it comes to the Constitution. And I said to him, before 1982, the court couldn't really do much, but now they are overturning legislation. And he said that's not true. Before 1982, we did have inalienable rights. It was just through common law, and it wasn't really codified. So then 82 comes along, and it puts this reasonable limits thing. And I understand, like, legally, constitutionally, there's an argument to be made. But I'm just looking at this, and I go back to the concept of rule of law. We're all individuals. We recognize that we're the only people on this planet that are of a conscience. There is no government. To me, it's a jurisdictional issue. Like, government can't come in and tell me, Payman, you have to think this way. Like, that's between me and God. It is not me and government.
You're absolutely correct. And like it says that in the charter, the preamble says that it acknowledges that Canada was founded on principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And this is why criminal law is very, very fundamentally different than civil law, because it's it's harder to go to the public and justify reasonable limits why someone should murder someone and get away with it, or someone should come to your house and rob your house. But there should be no reasonable limits to that, and that's the way it should be, right? We have, this is why I look at things, we have to start looking at things outside of that. And now we have to remove, like I said, the only way forward, section 1, it's got to go, because we have to have articulated inalienable rights, right? My rights come from God. Your job as government is to protect my rights, not to grant rights. And what they do is, in the charter, is saying that we're going to give you the privilege of having these rights, but we can take them away at any point in time. And that's not the way it's supposed to go.
So I agree the same way, but it's strange. What I'm saying is there is no government. Like, government doesn't exist. We've just made it up. Like, you, Dale, me, I don't know, the remanded, a couple of these people in the audience. You know, we're the only people in Canada, and we come up with a set of rules. We call it the law, and we come up with this office we designated the court, and you know, those rules, as they're enforced in that building, that becomes the rule of law. And you know, every month we give a little bit of money to pay for the rent and keeping the lights on. That's sort of the government. But what I'm saying is, this stuff is meant for us, but somehow government's like elevated itself, and now it's pretending that it operates above this hypothetical rule of law. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Yes, and this is where people are looking at things. The crown, they're looking at the crown and saying that the crown has, immunity for certain things. The crown does not have, the crown's representatives don't have immunity from treason. They don't, right? So while they may sit down and say the king can do what they want, no, they can't. When you go back to the Magna Carta, what happened with the Magna Carta? Well, the king said, I'm going to pledge the crown to Rome. The baron said, no, you're not. You do that, we're going to overthrow you, and we're going to put the next one in line, because you're not taking our sons to go fight some wars that doesn't involve us, and you're not taking our money. We're getting taxed to death, that we can't feed ourselves. Our people that are working there can't feed ourselves, and we don't want our children going to die. So he backed away and said no, and then they started to bring in all of these different things. So we have to go back. We need to go back and understand that this is the way things have to be. Governments are men, they're human beings, and they're public servants. That means they're slaves to our will. We elect them to do the things that we can't go and do ourselves, because it doesn't make sense to have all 40 million people going down to Ottawa to try and go and solve a problem. So you elect those people, and you don't have the 5 million people in Alberta and BC go down to their respective capitals in Victoria and Edmonton to go and do that. So what do? You send somebody to do that. So yes, there's nothing wrong with them getting paid to do a job, but they're there to do our will, not to go there and act like kings. And we have to start changing the way that we think, because we don't have to beg these people to do anything. They're there. We're to tell them what they are to do. And that's where we feel that they're in a position of power, that we should treat them like a god, or a king. They're not. They're there to do our will. Even the king can't go, they can only go so far, because if not, then their subjects they'll revolt, right? That's really it. We have to treat them the same way. They're just men and women.
So Wolf in the comments, he's giving a history lesson on the Magna Carta, but unfortunately we don't have time for that today, Wolf. I wanted to move on, Dale, to your case, your allegation of treason and the Winnipeg thing. I want to I just want to simplify a couple of things. You're an engineer. You saw something, and you made a complaint about it, and then the college that regulates you, the College of Engineers, they kind of attacked you. Then they used You use the phrase torture. I'm assuming that they use the version of the BC Mental Health Act to drug you. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm an engineering technologist. I'm actually not licensed under Apex. This is why they're very mad. I'm under the technologist. I got a 4-year degree. The work is pretty much identical. It's just some minor technical details, mainly word salad that makes the difference because the work is the same. Anyway, I came out with this stuff and I, pointed out the issues, and I'm like, you can't do this. Suffice to say, I know that if I did this, I would go to prison. Like, this is way off base. So I reported it. They didn't like it. And one of the things is they couldn't discipline me, and they were trying to find out the engineers that I was working with. And because the corporation that I'd started, I was like, no. And I said, the way that it's structured, weren't directly under my employee. They weren't my employees, because I knew that if I did that, they would crucify them because I was going against the government. And I wanted to protect the people that I was working with, so they wouldn't go after their licenses. So what they ended up doing was they took me, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, who I talked to several times, and then I went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and filed complaints on July 3rd of 2020 for criminal negligence. 2 of them. One for the corporation and one for myself. And because they couldn't deal with that, because they would end up having to have them come on record and put these things on record, they couldn't do it. So what did they do when I went to go to the court? Because they shut me out and wouldn't let me talk to the officers or any of that stuff. So I took them to court. They arrested me in front of the court. They dragged me and strapped me to a bed, drugged me against my will, and they were interrogating me during that time.
Right. I'm not trying to be indifferent to your suffering, but I'm just looking at this. So they tried to go through the college route. It didn't work. They didn't want to go through the court system because it'd be on the record. So they went through the law enforcement route. They got law enforcement to block your entry and arrest you. And then they went through the public health route. And when they drugged you against your will, which you're calling torture, which it is. I'm just trying to simplify it for the audience.
Yes.
They're abusing their powers to crush a citizen.
Yes, like Dr. Mel Bruchet. He
Yeah,
talked
yeah.
talked about the spike proteins and what they were doing to babies, and they drugged him. Like, they did it very bad, and they tried to do that to a pharmacist in Ontario as well. This is the Canadian way.
There's a unrelated, but there's a member in the audience, Kirk Reese. Same thing.
Yes.
The military whistleblower from L'Orange. They use the
Yes.
BC Mental Health Act. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is. I don't know if people realize this. The BC Mental Health Act, as bad as it is, it's supposed to be designed for people that are actually suffering depression or they're bipolar, not to be used against whistleblowers.
Yes, and the way that they have the ambiguous language, and it's bad, but even still, in my case, they still broke the law. Like, clearly, like, I had them on film. The woman that came there, she had her hands in her pockets, her head down, didn't say a word. They said that they tried to tell me that I needed to submit to an examination. They didn't. Woman even put it in her notes that I didn't actually say anything. She said she tried to get my attention, but she didn't, because I was talking, but didn't actually tell me to do anything, and talked to her supervisor, and they said they go ahead with the warrants anyway. Go to get the warrants anyway. So they know they didn't comply with the law. So they went ahead and they lied, even though the law says that you have to swear that this was true, but they didn't direct me at any point in time to go get an examination. And so they broke their own law in order to go get that warrant, and they didn't have the warrant in hand. They didn't present it like the law said, because I was asking, where's the warrant? Even when I was getting arrested.
I saw the video. Yeah.
Because they have to have a warrant in hand so that they have to present it to the doctor. They never did any of that. The warrant didn't show up until days after, while I was already strapped to a bed getting drugged.
The other thing, I wanted to say, Mel Bruchet, with this mental health approach where they drug you against your will and they put you in an insane asylum, a lot of the times people come out of that like almost insane because it's trauma and you've been drugged. And then, they parade this guy in front of a camera, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, the government was justified in, detaining them."
Yes, they do. A lot of the times they do end up dictating it. Like before I got into engineering and stuff like that, when I was a lot younger, I worked as a healthcare aide. My mother was a nurse. She worked in mental facilities. I also worked in some mental facilities. The drugs were the ones that made the guys drool. They didn't come in there drooling, but when they started to drug them, they started to drool. And when they drugged me, like I started to have some, like I was losing bladder control and all that kind of stuff, unsteady on my feet. And I thank God that I was able to get restored, because my mother, even when she called with the drugs that they knew they were giving me, she asked them, "What are you trying to do? Kill my son?" Because she's like, "I worked in mental facilities." She goes, "I had to give people drugs." She's like, "What you're doing is wrong." And then they were giving me drugs that I had no idea what they were. Like, I mean, no idea. And so they do things to people to make them crazy, and that is wrong. Because a lot, if you read the side effects of these types of drugs, a lot of the mental health symptoms that they're supposed to be suppressing are actually what they get from the side effects.
It's like that scene from Planet of the Apes where they lobotomize that guy. Like,
Yes,
they come out and you're like, well, what did you expect? You gave the guy so much drugs, now he can't even speak coherently.
the doctor actually there in the hospital told me that they needed to slow my brain down. I'm like, really, really,
That's not a watch.
right? Like that's. I mean, you guys are they're criminals. Like they're protecting each other, and the fact that people are doing this, and this is one of the issues with the immigration. Tell you why. They bring over a lot of these doctors that are immigrants, right? And if they don't play ball, they'll send them back. They'll pull their licenses. A lot of them come here with their license, they can't even practice medicine. So they lie to them, bring them over here, and then now they're working, driving a cab or whatever, doing some menial labor. And the ones that do come here and they're able to practice, if you don't toe the government line, they'll yank your PR card. You're gone, right? So they'll get things where a lot of Canadians would be like, no, and flip them the bird and walk out. But these guys, they'll bend because they don't want to go back to where they came from. It costs them a lot of money and whatever the case may be. So they pressure them.
No,
So
that I can agree with. When you're an immigrant, you operate in a state of fear, sort of, that you're always going to be kicked out. This is why it's always good to have immigrant neighbors. If you have pets, they never complain. They don't file a noise complaint. One of the benefits of mass immigration. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
just touching on that. That's also some of the mass immigration is also tied to the election interference and so forth, because they're not, when you look at the immigrants that they're bringing over, and there's nothing wrong with immigration done in a proper manner. We've seen this throughout human history, but they're opening up the floodgates, bringing in a class of immigrants that normally wouldn't be able to immigrate, and they're bringing them over intentionally that they can control them because they don't integrate. There's language barriers, and then they can direct what they're doing. Segregation works to the advantage of people. And then when you see people stoking the fires of racial division, this is wrong, because it only furthers the agenda of the people that are up there. Because some of those immigrants don't even want to be here. Some of them immigrants don't want to be in these situations, but they don't know any better, right? Some of them are straight criminals that they're bringing there. And then some of the guys that have been here for a long time, they don't like this because they left it, right? The guys that left in places because their families were getting killed. Like I talked to a guy from Iran. He didn't like what was going on. His parents hate the guys that were doing all this stuff because he's like, all my brothers are dead except for me, right? You think we love what was going on with the guys that killed our family? When they came to talk to him after like September 11th, he was like, get off my doorstep. Don't come back with that nonsense. They killed more of my family than they killed of yours, so get out of here, right? He was angry. And so guys that leave for reasons like that, they don't want that. So we should be talking to those guys that don't want that stuff, so that we can deal with the people who are doing the wrong and correctly identifying it, right? So we shouldn't work on those. We really need to rethink our strategy on how we're doing things.
So, like looking back, one of the main reasons now that I know what I know that my family left Iran and came here is for the rule of law. Like the law used to be applied dispassionately here, whereas in Iran, it's not applied dispassionately. It's who knows what judge, and if you go up against the government, you're screwed. So I always tell people, Canada, it is a Middle Eastern country. Like it's a third world country. What do we got? No rule of law. We got corruption, and we got inflation. Those are the three markers of a third world country.
Yes, this is a failed nation. Like Canada is a failed nation right now because we have no control. The government is running away with power. They're using everything that they can. And Trudeau should not be in government. Jagmeet Singh should not be in government. Like, none of the guys, as far as I'm concerned, everybody in Ottawa, every single one of them need to be replaced. Every single one of the 338, they need to be replaced. Right? There needs to be more accountability. And the people, we have to start taking personal responsibility, because every single one of us are responsible for this, because we allowed them to get this far and we're allowing them to continue. And people are like, well, what can I do? I'm like, there's a lot we can do. First of all, we need to understand our law. We need to take action, because if there wasn't anything we couldn't do, they wouldn't be spending all this time trying to suppress us. We have more power than we think.
I got to go to Kirk. I refused the drugs. They said I would never get out unless I took meds. I got out when I told them I was recording them. He had a recording device on him. Yeah.
Yes, they had taken away my phone when they strapped me to a bed and drugged me, because they knew I recorded everything, and I put it out online because I knew what they were doing, right? And so I knew that if I didn't leave a public record, they would have done bad things. Wasn't hard to figure that one out.
Yeah, they never like saying anything on the record, but then they always force you to do things on the record. Like they'll say, answer this question, or we can wait for your lawyer to come in 8 hours. You're like, all right, fine, officer. What do you want to know?
Well, yes, and this is the whole thing. They manipulate the situation. And judges, this whole idea of judicial immunity, this is something that is unconstitutional. It exists on no document. It doesn't. It's not a law or anything like that. It's just a practice that they practice. Now, judges should not have judicial immunity. Yes, they can have for things for minor errors, but a judge is got a lot of responsibility. First of all, judges are not to interpret the law. That's wrong. Judges are there to apply the law, because what they've done with case law, and you look at cases, and case law is being used wrong, and it's been used wrong for a very long time. Judges are using case law to construct law and create, like, a lot of the stuff that they're calling precedent or actually construction of laws, using case law to circumvent both the law and the charter, right? And they do this so much by so many bad decisions that they're actually moved away from what the law should be like. And they teach the lawyers this, and they're so used to this as the practice that it becomes hard for them to move away from this, right? There are some lawyers that aren't, but they get destroyed, and they can't do what they want because the law societies, which are, the bar essentially, they will rip them to shreds. And so they have control of the oversight bodies, which are like the College of Physicians, the engineering bodies, and so forth, that are actually punishing the people who are standing up and doing what's right. So even though a lawyer doesn't like what's going on, he knows, or she knows, that if I go ahead and I do this, they're going to come after me, right? This is why they don't like self-represented litigants. They don't, because who's going to discipline you? And I would tell them, I said, you can't commit a crime. I said, that's fraud, right? I mean, for example, Federal Court of Canada, they serve documents, and I have this in my documentation. They said that I received service. The email address was wrong. I said, so how did I receive service to an address that it was impossible for me to receive the email? And then there's crickets, right? Then they actually changed the date, and then they ended up forcing a date on me. I said, I need more time. Like, they were serving me while they knew I was in Colorado in an immigration detention center. Like, I received documents and they were having hearings without my knowledge. And the courts, the Crown, and everybody else was involved in criminal activity, right? That's crime. They're committing fraud right there. I mean, this
Let's
is our justice system.
in wrapping up the show, I want to simplify the legal system in lay terms, let's say, layman's terms. Um, you have you got the two judges, but you basically have a defendant and you have a, what is it, the plaintiff. So you got these two guys. They could sometimes have a lawyer, and you have a jury that makes the decision. Like, the jury is the god in this case that oversees everything, and the judge is just a referee, right? Like, the judge tells the lawyer, lower your voice, get off your phone, like that. This is the rules of the court, right?
Yes.
But people have this impression that it's the judge, not the jury, that's God in this example.
Well, yes, the jury is supposed to be the jury of your peers, but in civil matters in Canada, in the federal court, for example, Federal Court of Canada, there are no jury trials. And that's what needs to change, because they have a lot of these abilities to have closed hearings and cut people off from the public. And what you're seeing in Canada is the Inquisition is really being practiced in our courts. And even with, for example, what Judge Associate Chief Justice Rooke did with me, he created hearings like I was present in the court when I wasn't even there, and then constructed a whole like narrative and then sent it to me. So I wasn't even there. And they had hearings and created all of these things, and then they actually had the nerve to show me the documents of what they actually took this from, which were other cases of somebody else, and showed that partially and then changed it and then sent it over to me. This is how arrogant these people are. And that's all in
So
documents. Yeah.
you mentioned Rook. It's as if Tony Soprano ran the courts and you were suing a member of his crew,
That's
kind of thing.
exactly it. That's exactly it. This is why right now the only because I have evidence from Dr. Macus and other people in courts, not only in Canada but in the United States, showing the same type of thing. So when you go through so many different jurisdictions, you have an adequate sample size to determine that if you're seeing in all of these different jurisdictions people who are completely they have no connection to each other, the same thing is happening. This tells you that there is a system of organized crime operating within the judicial system. And that is not, nobody's getting justice. Sure, some people might get through, but the worst offenders are going to make sure their people come in and block the door. So when you have a breakdown of the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is the most important branch of the government, because you can have the executive fail, you can have the legislative fail, but if you have the judicial branch and have the rule of law, the country can still function until you can restore the executive and the legislative, because it's to make sure that people can live with each other. But when that is, and it's also there for the person to restrain the executive and the legislative, but when that fails, there's only one place that fixes it, and that's where the people speak, is through the legislative branches. And so we have to go after the legislative branches while we're going into the courts, and we have to tell them that we're not backing down, because you have to fix this, because the judicial branch is broken. And the Constitution in both Canada and the United States, they both are very clear on who has to create the laws to control the judicial branches, and that's the legislative.
No, there's a beautiful words to end with, but I kind of just wanted to talk about Rook. What is wrong with this guy? Like, he was a judge involved in your case. This is unrelated. This is I just put this up. Um, Rooke was involved with your case, involved with Artur Pavlovsky's case, maybe Makis. I don't know, but was this guy evil
Yes.
incarnate? Is he psychologically damaged?
Based on what I look at Rook has got a predatory nature, for that's guaranteed. There's a probability that he's engaged in some type of illicit activity that he's not. Like, I mean, he's got the mindset of a pedophile. He's a predator. He preys on the weak, and this is the type of mindset that if he's not, he's very close to being in it, or he's associated with those kinds of people. He's definitely a traitor, which is that's the mindset of a pedophile and a traitor are almost identical. And he's protecting pedophiles. So by nature, regardless of whether you're actively doing it or not, you're still a pedophile, because no reasonable human being is going to protect people who are engaged in the trafficking and molesting of children. That is insane as a judge. So something's wrong with him. He is a criminal to no end. He went after Artur, he went after Makis, he went after me, and he's gone after a lot of people. Like, you go back and read stuff, you will find a long history of Rooke. They call him Rooke the Crook, and I actually called him Rooke the Crook, and he lost his mind.
This is in court?
Yeah, I didn't get to call, like, never actually was in front of him in court, but it was all by writing, and I called him
Rook
Rooke
the
the Crook.
crook.
Yes, because I mentioned some of the stuff that they talked about and how he treated self-represented litigants.
Yeah, I've heard stories, and it kind of interests me how these judges are so thin-skinned. Like for you and me, people could say whatever they want to us, and we kind of understand that we have to maintain our composure. But judges, they just lose it.
Because they expect people to kiss their feet, right? Like, I mean, I've talked to judges, and judges have told me things, and I said no. I said, listen, I'm a Christian. If you think that I'm going to accept your lie, it's never going to happen. I said, you're going to have to kill me first. He said, if God tells me not to kill my neighbor and you expect me to walk away and kill my neighbor, it's not going to happen. I said, I don't care what you do to me. It's never going to happen, because I have to do what I know is right. And they don't like when people say that. They want people to bend over them. It's like they've gotten so used to having that position that no human being should have. You're a man that is supposed to weigh between two cases based on what the law says. That's it. You're not, like, I mean, when they sit down and, even use certain titles, I don't. And especially when a judge is being a criminal, I tell him, I call him by his name. Yes, why should I call you Your Honor? You have nothing honorable when you're jailing pastors. You're protecting people who are poisoning people with those vaccines and everything else like that, and the people who are taking away freedom. Why should I call you Your Honor? You're not honorable. That'd be a lie.
You start calling them your dishonor or your crookness.
No, I call one judge here, call her Schwan, right? I said, look, Schwan, and I told her straight out, I said, whoever's doing this to you, I said, they're not going to be able to protect you forever, because nobody's above the law, not even you as a judge. I said, you can't. She's the one who concealed the defrauding of the fraudulent documents that the government submitted regarding my house. The government of Saskatchewan, right? They brought fraudulent documents in front of a judge that I didn't sign, that somebody else signed like they were me, and they went ahead and did this behind my back.
So I would file that under both corruption and the erosion of the rule of law, which are the two of the three pillars of being a third world country.
Yes.
And I've done maybe 100 interviews now, and I talk to regular Canadians, and it's a common theme. Do you know Trevor Halsworth?
No.
He's got a minor case. Well, he still did jail time, but he goes through family law, and his wife's lawyer submitted fraudulent evidence, and he complained about it to the judge, and he provided court evidence showing that it was fraudulent. So the judge just gave an avenue for the lawyer to sneak out of by letting the lawyer's client, the wife, come and lie on the stand. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to go with what she said and not what the court evidence said. And he just let the lawyer get off. And it's just a common theme.
Yes, and this is where law enforcement comes in, and a lot of them don't want to do this. They're reluctant. But if you go and you read the criminal code, and I believe it's three section 380 subsection 1 for fraud, right? 380 or 280, one of the two. I'm pretty sure. So you go and you look at it, and it mentions things like testamentary instruments. This is wills. This is solely under the domain of civil, and it doesn't tell you that there's any place that this is allowed. Crimes can occur anywhere. Like if like I asked the police officer. I said, "So what happens if the judge pulls out a gun and he shoots someone in the court? You're telling me that you can't arrest the judge for doing that?" And then he was just like, didn't want to say anything because they want to act like it's a court. I'm like, a crime can occur anywhere. It doesn't matter where it is, right? And even in a courtroom. And the civil court system, they use this to say that they're completely separate. And they're, for most intents and purposes, they are, because civil matters can't try criminal cases. But the criminal law has to govern everything to make sure that there's no crime there. Now, if you don't have criminal law overlooking the civil branch of the judicial system, then what ends up happening? Then criminals will go in there knowing full well that they can commit crimes in the court, knowing that there be no restraint on them for that. You've created the perfect opportunity for organized crime to exist. And actually, this was outlined in the report that they put out to Parliament, saying that the foreign interference comes in different levels, and that every level is it's affected. Every level of government, and there's no effective controls. And law enforcement and the administration of justice is also affected. That includes the law enforcement, the judges, and everywhere else. There's a lot of foreign interference inside of our country, and our country is being structured in a manner that's favorable for organized crime to exist and foreign interference to flourish. And the people have to understand, the immigrants that you can see, that's not your greatest enemy. The greatest enemy are the ones that are sitting inside those government buildings, inside those law courts, inside of the law enforcement agencies that are working as agents of other states, working for their interests and not the interests of Canadians.
Boom. There's the trailer right there. I'll go clip it out right now. Dale, give me your plug, your show. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, you can follow me at DJS Richardson on Truth X Gettr, the Karis Project on Truth X, Facebook, and so forth. My links are on my page on the Karis Project as well. I mean, we've got different ways to support. I mean, we're on Frank's speech with the Karis Project on Faith and Family, so you guys can catch us there. We got My Pillow. If you've never tried it, try it out. Get a pillow for Christmas for your loved ones. They sell other stuff too. And I mean, if you want to just donate directly, because we're going to be raising funds to go after these guys in court and file criminal complaints, because we don't, in Canada, we don't need to go through the Crown. We can do it ourselves. And so this is what needs to be done, because accountability has to come. And if we don't hold the government accountable, I mean, it's like, would you let your 2-year-old run your house? And that's really it. So share the information, come check us out. And that's really it.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but how do they donate directly?
We have a donor box that's for the Karis Project. If you go to the page, they should have the all my links. Or you go to my page, it'll be on my all my links. There's a donor box and a Give Send Go where they can do that. Or if you're in Canada, there's e-transfer and that kind of stuff. Whatever way works.
Sounds good. You heard it. You heard them, guys. Go and donate whatever you can, whenever you can. Dale, thank you so much for coming on. To you and the audience, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.